What's up out there, Liquid Trucking? I'm your host, Marcus. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Liquid Trucking Podcast. And today's episode is another special one because we are bringing you another episode of Trucking Up History presented by the Liquid Trucking Podcast. And today we're talking about the department that keeps America moving or sometimes stands in our way. This is the history of the Department of Transportation.
Welcome to the gold standard of podcasts for the gold standard of drivers. This is the Liquid Trucking Podcast with your host, Marcus Bridges.
There are certain things in trucking that are so common we rarely stop to ask where they came from. The DOT number on the side of the truck, the CDL in a driver's wallet, hours of service rules, drug testing, bridge inspections, hazmat regulations, trailer dimensions, crash investigations, road construction funding, weight stations, safety ratings, and of course, enough paperwork to make you wonder whether the federal government is secretly being paid by the toner cartridge industry. All of those things, in one way or another, connect back to the United States Department of Transportation. Today, the letters DOT carry a lot of weight. Drivers hear them and may immediately picture inspections, logbooks, roadside enforcement, regulations, and a person wearing a reflective vest who has just asked them to pull around back. But the Department of Transportation is much larger than trucking enforcement. It oversees or influences aviation, highways, railroads, public transport, pipelines, maritime transportation, hazardous materials, vehicle safety, and the massive infrastructure network that allows people and freight to move through the United States. And despite transportation being one of the most important functions of a modern country, the United States did not create a cabinet-level Department of Transportation until the 1960s. Before that, responsibility for transportation was scattered across the federal government like tools after a busy week in the shop. Highways were handled in one place, aviation was somewhere else. Railroads had their own agencies. Maritime programs were tucked into other departments. Safety responsibilities were divided among organizations that did not always communicate efficiently with one another. By the mid-1960s, the federal government finally looked at this arrangement and said, essentially, does anybody know where we put transportation? The answer became the United States Department of Transportation. The department was officially established by law in 1966 and began operating on April 1st, 1967. That's right, April Fool's Day. The federal agency responsible for transportation began its official life on April 1st, which may explain why drivers have occasionally looked at a regulation and wondered whether somebody was joking. But the creation of the DOT was no joke. It represented one of the largest reorganizations of the federal government in decades. It brought together dozens of existing transportation programs, tens of thousands of employees, and responsibilities that touch nearly every American citizen and business. To understand why the DOT was created and how it became such a major presence in trucking, we need to travel back to a time when America had plenty of roads, but not much of a national road system. And we will be traveling without GPS, electronic logs, air conditioning, or a truck stop every 40 miles. So pack a sandwich, because this might take a while. Before the DOT, building a country one mud hole at a time. For much of the 1800s, transportation policy in the United States was mostly a collection of local decisions. Cities built streets, counties built roads, states funded certain routes. Private companies operated toll roads, canals, railroads, and bridges. The federal government supported some transportation projects, but there was no unified national department coordinating the entire system. Railroads became the dominant form of long-distance transport during the 19th century. They moved freight, passengers, mail, livestock, raw materials, and almost anything else that needed to travel farther than a horse wanted to go. Roads, meanwhile, were often a different story. Outside major cities, many roads were little more than dirt paths. When conditions were dry, they could be rough. When it rained, they could become mud holes. When winter arrived, they became whatever Mother Nature felt like producing that morning. The earliest automobiles and commercial trucks entered a country whose road network had not been designed for engines, heavy loads, or dependable year-round travel. In 1893, the federal government created the Office of Road Inquiry inside the Department of Agriculture. Its initial budget, $10,000. That may sound like an odd place to put the nation's early highway program, but at the time, rural roads were largely considered an agricultural issue. Farmers needed reliable roads to move crops, livestock, equipment, and supplies. The Office of Road Inquiry studied road construction, distributed technical information, and encouraged better building practices. It did not possess the power or money to construct the national highway network. Its job was closer to saying, here's how you might build a decent road, and hoping somebody had the funds and motivation to do it. The arrival of the automobile created pressure for greater federal involvement. Drivers wanted reliable routes between communities. Businesses saw opportunities to move products by road. Farmers wanted to access markets. And as vehicles improved, the roads became the weak link. In 1916, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Aid Road Act. The law created a lasting partnership between the federal government and state highway departments. It authorized $75 million over 5 years for road construction, with the federal government generally paying no more than half the cost of an approved project. The law also required participating states to establish highway departments capable of planning and supervising the work. This partnership became the basic formula for American highway funding. The federal government provides money and national standards, while state and local governments own, design, construct, maintain, and operate most of the roads. That distinction is still important today. Despite the name Federal Highway, Uncle Sam is not personally out there filling potholes. If he were, there would probably be a 6-page form attached to every bucket of asphalt. During the 1920s and 1930s, federal highway programs expanded. Numbered routes created more consistency across state lines. The automobile industry grew. Motor trucks became increasingly important to commerce. The Great Depression brought federal public works projects, and World War II demonstrated how critical transportation infrastructure was to national defense. The war also highlighted the benefits of Germany's Autobahn system. Although the idea that President Dwight Eisenhower invented the interstate system after seeing the Autobahn is an oversimplification. American officials had discussed national superhighways before World War II, and federal planners had already studied possible interstate networks. Eisenhower's wartime experiences did, however, strengthen his belief that the United States needed a dependable national highway system. In 1956, he signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, launching the modern interstate highway system and creating the Highway Trust Fund to help pay for it through federal fuel taxes. The interstates transformed American life. They changed where people lived, where businesses operated, how communities developed, and how quickly freight could move. Trucking companies could build interstate networks with predictable routes and improved travel times. Manufacturers could locate facilities further from rail lines. Distribution centers could serve enormous geographic areas. Perishable goods could travel farther. Just-in-time logistics became more practical. The interstate system was a circulatory system for a new national economy, and trucking became one of its most important blood cells. Although calling a truck driver a blood cell will probably not help much during recruiting, so remember that, Jake. By the early 1960s, transportation had become too important and too interconnected to remain divided among unrelated federal organizations. America now had a jet aircraft, expanding highways, growing cities, busy ports, major rail networks, pipelines, public transit systems, and millions of increasingly powerful motor vehicles. The country had built a transportation machine. It just did not have one department responsible for looking at the entire machine. The creation of the Department of Transportation. On March 2nd, 1966, President Lyndon B. Johnson sent Congress a special message proposing a cabinet-level Department of Transportation. Johnson argued that transportation was essential to economic growth, national security, urban development, public safety, and the daily lives of Americans. But federal transportation responsibilities had become fragmented. Different agencies established policies for different modes. Their programs sometimes overlapped. Decisions involving highways, railroads, aviation, shipping, and mass transit could be made independently, even when those modes competed for the same passengers, freight, land, and federal dollars. The proposed department would bring major transportation functions together and give the president a cabinet secretary capable of developing a national transportation policy. Congress passed the Department of Transportation Act, and President Johnson signed it on October 15, 1966. The new department was assembled from 31 previously scattered organizational elements and approximately 95,000 employees. That made it one of the largest reorganizations in the history of the executive branch. The agencies and functions brought into the DOT included the Federal Aviation Agency, the Bureau of Public Roads, the Coast Guard, the Federal Railroad Administration, the St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation, and portions of other federal programs. Some of those organizations were renamed or restructured. The Bureau of Public Roads helped form the Federal Highway Administration. The Federal Aviation Agency became the Federal Aviation Administration. New administrations were created to oversee railroads and urban mass transportation. In other words, the federal government did what every family eventually does with cluttered garbage. It pulled everything outside, stared at it for a while, renamed some of it, moved some of it around, and then put most of it into a larger garbage can. Allen S. Boyd became the first United States Secretary of Transportation. He was sworn in on January 16, 1967, and faced the enormous task of combining different agencies, cultures, systems, laws, and priorities into one functioning department. The department's first official day of operation, as mentioned, was April 1, 1967. Its mission extended far beyond building roads. It was expected to coordinate transportation policy, improve safety, support economic growth, encourage technological development, and balance the transportation needs of cities, rural areas, businesses, passengers, and freight carriers. That was an enormous assignment. Transportation policy is rarely simple because every decision creates winners, losers, costs, benefits, and arguments. Build a highway and some communities gain access, while others lose homes or businesses. Increase safety regulation and crashes may decline, while compliance costs rise. Fund one transportation mode and supporters of another mode want to know where their money went. Expand trucking and consumers benefit from faster deliveries, while roads experience more wear. Transportation is where economics, engineering, politics, geography, safety, environmental concerns, and human behavior all arrive at the same intersection. And apparently, none of them know who has the right of way. When safety became a national mission. The creation of the DOT came during a period of growing concern about highway deaths. Vehicle travel had increased dramatically after World War II. Cars and trucks became faster and more powerful, but safety standards had not always kept pace. Seatbelts were not yet universally required equipment. Vehicle interiors contained hard metal surfaces. Windshields, steering columns, doors, tires, brakes, and fuel systems were not governed by the kind of federal performance standards that exist today. In 1966, Congress passed both the Highway Safety Act and the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act. These laws created stronger federal authority over vehicle design and highway safety programs. They established the foundation for federal motor vehicle safety standards and required the development of coordinated highway safety programs. When the DOT opened in 1967, it inherited these growing responsibilities. In 1970, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, was established within the department. The NHTSA became responsible for vehicle safety standards, crash data, recalls, consumer information, behavioral safety programs, and research involving everything from seatbelts and airbags to improved driving and child restraints. The change was significant. The federal government was no longer treating highway deaths as unavoidable cost of mobility. Crashes could be studied. Vehicles could be made safer. Roads could be redesigned. Driver behavior could be influenced. And emergency response could improve. More than 52,000 people died in American traffic crashes in 1970. The country had fewer vehicles and fewer miles traveled than it does today, but the fatality rate was substantially higher. Since then, federal standards have influenced collapsible steering columns, stronger door locks, improved brakes, energy-absorbing interiors, safety glass, seat belts, airbags, child restraints, electric stability control, backup cameras, and numerous other technologies. The NHTSA has estimated that federal motor vehicle safety standards saved more than 860,000 lives between 1968 and 2019. That does not mean the DOT deserves sole credit for every improvement. Automakers, state governments, law enforcement, emergency responders, researchers, safety advocates, road designers, private companies, and individual drivers all contributed. But the statistics demonstrate the impact of treating highway safety as an organized national effort rather than a collection of isolated local problems. The estimated number of traffic deaths for 2025 was approximately 36,640. That's still a devastating number, roughly 100 lives lost every day. But it occurred during an era where Americans traveled trillions of vehicle miles. The estimated fatality rate for 2025 was 1.10 deaths for every 100 million vehicle miles traveled, one of the lowest rates ever recorded. The progress is real, but it is incomplete. The DOT's modern safety challenge is no longer simply convincing people that crashes can be prevented. It's identifying which combinations of technology, infrastructure, regulation, enforcement, education, and human judgment will prevent the next one. That question is particularly important in trucking. A professional driver does not operate in an isolated environment. That driver shares the road with distracted motorists, inexperienced teenagers, exhausted commuters, motorcycles, pedestrians, construction workers, tourists, RVs, rental trucks, and somebody who just realized their exit was 30 feet behind them. The safest truck driver in America is still operating inside a system filled with variables. DOT safety programs attempt to manage those variables, not always perfectly, and certainly not always without irritating somebody, but with the understanding that transportation safety is a shared responsibility. The DOT also originally included the National Transportation Safety Board. The NTSB investigates major transportation accidents and makes safety recommendations afterward. However, Congress later determined that an investigative agency needed complete independence from the department responsible for regulating and promoting transportation. In 1974, the NTSB was reestablished as a separate entity outside the DOT. That separation created an important system of checks and balances. The DOT can issue regulations and operate programs, while the NTSB can investigate accidents and criticize those programs when necessary. It is the governmental equivalent of having one person cook dinner and another person ask why the smoke alarm is going off. How deregulation changed American trucking. During the 1970s, the DOT became involved in another enormous transformation: deregulation. For decades, the Interstate Commerce Commission tightly regulated railroads, trucking companies, routes, commodities, entry into markets, and freight rates. A trucking company could not always begin hauling a new commodity or operating a new route simply because it found a willing customer. It might need government-granted operating authority. Existing carriers could object. Rates were heavily regulated. The system was designed partly to improve stability and prevent destructive competition, but it also created inefficiency. A truck might be authorized to carry one commodity in one direction, but lack the authority to haul a logical return load. Businesses faced limited carrier choices. New companies struggled to enter certain markets. Rates did not always reflect changing economic conditions. Imagine telling a modern dispatcher, yeah, there's freight available, the truck is empty, the customer's willing to pay, and the delivery is directly on the way home. But legally, we may not be allowed to haul it. After the dispatcher finished making a sound that only dogs could hear, the problem would become clear. Economic deregulation gained momentum during the administration of Presidents Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. Congress passed the Motor Carrier Act of 1980, substantially reducing federal control over the trucking industry. The law made it easier for new carriers to enter the market, expanded operating authority, reduced route and commodity restrictions, and gave carriers greater freedom to establish rates. Deregulation encouraged competition. Shippers gained more options. Trucking services became more flexible. Private carriers and owner-operators found new opportunities everywhere. An analysis published by the Federal Highway Administration later found that, after adjusting for inflation, the average revenue per truck mile in 1999 was approximately 53% of what it had been in 1980. For businesses and consumers, lower transportation costs help reduce the price of moving goods. For carriers and drivers, however, competition created intense pressure. Deregulation did not eliminate the need to pay for trucks, tires, fuel, insurance, repairs, wages, and maintenance. It simply made it harder to pass every cost along to the customer. The modern trucking industry, with its thin margins, constant rate competition, large national carriers, small fleets, owner-operators, brokers, contract freight, and spot markets, was heavily shaped by the changes of 1980. Deregulation produced tremendous efficiency, but efficiency is rarely relaxing for the people expected to provide it. Consumers gained access to more goods, faster deliveries, and lower transportation costs. Meanwhile, the trucking industry learned how to move freight with less empty mileage, tighter schedules, better equipment utilization, and approximately 11 minutes of breathing room. Railroads expected similar deregulation through the Staggers Rail Act of 1980, while commercial aviation had already undergone major deregulation back in 1978. These changes altered the DOT's role. Instead of controlling many commercial decisions directly, the department increasingly focused on safety, infrastructure, competition, research, and system performance. The government stepped back from telling carriers exactly what they could haul and where they could haul it. But it was nowhere near finished telling them how safely they should do it. National standards for trucks and drivers. As trucking expanded across state lines, inconsistent state rules became a serious problem. States maintained different regulations involving truck dimensions, licensing, and operations. Equipment that was legal in one state might face different restrictions after crossing a border. Congress addressed part of this problem through the Surface Transportation Assistance Act of 1982. Among its major provisions, the law established more consistent truck size standards on the national network. States were required to allow semi-trailers at least 48 feet long and twin trailers of at least 28 feet long on qualifying routes. The law also increased the federal gasoline tax from 4 cents to 9 cents per gallon and dedicated 1 cent of the tax to public transportation. For trucking, national equipment standards were important because interstate commerce becomes difficult when every state treats a trailer like a separate legal theory. Isn't that right, California? But the 1980s also brought major changes to commercial driver licensing. Before 1986, there were no uniform national minimum standards for commercial driver licenses. Licensing requirements differed by state, and some drivers held licenses from multiple states. A driver disqualified in one jurisdiction could potentially continue operating under another license. Congress passed the Commercial Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 1986 to address the problem. The law established a national minimum standard for testing and licensing commercial drivers. It created the foundation for the modern CDL system and generally prohibited drivers from holding more than one commercial license. The principle was straightforward: one driver, one license, one driving record. Before that, a driver could apparently collect licenses like truck stop coffee mugs. The CDL system established different license classes, endorsements, testing requirements, and disqualification standards. States continued issuing licenses, but they had to meet federal requirements and share their information. This is another example of how the DOT usually operates. The federal government does not normally issue a driver's CDL. The state does. But the DOT, primarily through the FMCSA, establishes national standards that state programs must follow. The same federal-state relationship appears throughout transportation. Washington provides funding, requirements, technical standards, databases, and oversight, while the states handle much of the direct administration and enforcement. That arrangement can be effective. It can also produce a remarkable number of people who all believe the paperwork belongs to somebody else. Moving from highways to an interconnected transportation system. By the late 1980s, the original interstate highway system was approaching completion. The federal government faced a new question: what comes after building these interstates? And the answer arrived in 1991 through the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, usually called ISTEA or pronounced ICE-T, because apparently Congress decided transportation legislation needed a refreshing beverage. ICE-T represented a major shift in national transportation policy. Rather than treating highways, transit, freight, local roads, rail connections, and other transportation needs as entirely separate categories, the law promoted an intermodal approach. Intermodal means recognizing that a trip or shipment may depend on multiple forms of transportation. A load may begin on a truck, transfer to rail, pass through a port, cross an ocean, and return to a truck before actually reaching the customer. A commuter may drive to a transit station and take the train into the city. A manufacturer may depend on highways, rail service, pipelines, airports, and marine terminals. Every mode is a part of a larger system. ICE-T gave state and local officials greater flexibility in selecting projects and strengthened transportation planning requirements in metropolitan areas. It also directed greater attention toward freight movement, congestion, air quality, and the connections between different modes. For trucking, this mattered because freight does not begin and end on the interstate. A perfect national highway is not especially useful if the industrial road leading to the customer cannot handle the truck, or the bridge is restricted, or the port is backed up, or the rail terminal is inaccessible, or the final 5 miles resemble the surface of the moon. Transportation planning increasingly examined entire freight corridors rather than individual stretches of pavement. The change did not eliminate competition for funding. Highways, bridges, transit systems, rail projects, ports, airports, bicycle facilities, and pedestrian projects still compete for limited resources. But ICE-T changed the conversation. The goal was no longer simply to construct more highway mileage. The goal was to improve mobility throughout the system. That is a much broader mission and considerably more difficult to fit on a bumper sticker. The creation of the FMCSA. By the 1990s, commercial motor vehicle safety was still managed largely through an office inside the Federal Highway Administration. But trucking had become too large, too complex, and too important for motor carrier safety to remain one responsibility among many inside an agency primarily associated with highway construction and administration. Congress passed the Motor Carrier Safety Improvement Act of 1999, creating the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, otherwise known as FMCSA. FMCSA officially began operating on January 1st, 2000. Its primary mission was, and remains, reducing crashes, injuries, and fatalities involving large trucks and buses. FMCSA became responsible for many programs drivers and carriers associate most directly with the DOT. These include motor carrier registration, safety fitness, operating authority, hours of service regulations, commercial driver standards, drug and alcohol testing requirements, vehicle inspection standards, carrier investigations, and enforcement partnerships with states. FMCSA also administers the federal identification system that produces the U.S. Department of Transportation numbers displayed on commercial vehicles. For drivers, this is the portion of the department most likely to become personal. The Federal Aviation Administration probably will not care whether a tanker driver remembered to update a medical certificate, but the FMCSA absolutely will. The agency's creation reflected an important reality. A commercial truck is not merely a larger passenger vehicle. It may weigh tens of thousands of pounds, travel across multiple states, carry hazardous or food-grade materials, operate for long distances, and function as part of a company's commercial enterprise. The consequence of fatigue, poor maintenance, inadequate training, drug or alcohol use, or improper loading can be severe. FMCSA's regulations have therefore become some of the most debated rules in American transportation. Hours of service rules are a good example. The public wants drivers rested. Drivers want enough flexibility to handle traffic, parking shortages, customer delays, weather, loading times, and the actual realities of the job. Carriers need predictable operations. Shippers want on-time service. Receivers may still take 6 hours to unload a trailer while a hand-painted sign in the office says drivers must be on time. Creating a regulation that satisfies every part of the equation may be impossible. But the FMCSA exists because commercial vehicle safety requires specialized attention. And because asking airline regulators to settle the sleeper berth debate probably would not improve anyone's day. Transportation security and new technology. The terrorist acts of September 11th, 2001 changed transportation policy again. Congress created the Transportation Security Administration in November 2001. TSA was initially placed within the Department of Transportation and was given responsibility for protecting the nation's transportation systems, especially civil aviation. In 2003, TSA transferred to the newly created Department of Homeland Security. The United States Coast Guard, which had been part of the DOT since 1967, also moved to the Department of Homeland Security in 2003. These transfers demonstrate that the department's structure has never been permanent. Agencies move, responsibilities change, and new risks produce new organizations. In 2004, Congress created the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration within the DOT. PHMSA oversees the safe transportation of hazardous materials and the safety of the nation's pipeline system. Its responsibilities touch trucking directly. Hazardous classifications, shipping papers, packaging rules, placards, loading procedures, emergency response information, and training requirements all help determine how dangerous materials are transported by road. For a tanker fleet, those regulations are not distant pieces of federal history. They are part of everyday's operations. Technology has also been changing the way transportation was regulated. Paper records gave way to electronic databases. Satellite tracking improved fleet visibility. Vehicle systems recorded more information. Electronic logging devices replaced most paper logbooks. Crash data became more detailed. Inspections could be shared across states. Carriers could monitor equipment and driver performance in near real time. Drivers gained navigation, communication, weather, traffic, and safety tools that would have seemed like science fiction when the DOT first opened. The trade-off was visibility. The modern truck produces data about location, speed, engine operation, braking, driving time, inspections, maintenance, and performance. In 1967, a carrier might have needed 3 phone calls and a prayer to determine where a driver was. Today, somebody can probably tell which parking space the truck is sitting in and how aggressively it entered the lot. Transportation technology improves efficiency and safety, but it also creates new questions involving privacy, cybersecurity, automation, ownership of data, and how much monitoring is too much. Those questions will shape the DOT's next chapter. The DOT today. Today, the Department of Transportation is not one enormous agency performing every transportation function. It's an umbrella organization made up of the Office of the Secretary and 9 major operating administrations. They include the Federal Aviation Administration, the Federal Highway Administration, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, the Federal Railroad Administration, Federal Transit Administration, Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation, Maritime Administration, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. Each administration specializes in a different part of the transportation system, while the Office of the Secretary develops broader policy and coordinates the department. According to the DOT's fiscal year 2024 reporting, the department had approximately 55,000 employees. Those employees help oversee or support a national network containing approximately 4.2 million miles of public roads, 110,000 miles of major railroad routes, 25,000 miles of navigable waterways, 1.8 million miles of oil and gas pipelines, 5,200 public use airports, and approximately 2,200 public transportation agencies. That is a staggering system. But here is one of the most misunderstood facts about the department. The federal government does not own most American transportation infrastructure. Using 2018 federal highway data, only about 4% of public road mileage was federally owned. The state and local governments owned the overwhelming majority. Most airports are not operated by the DOT. Most transit agencies are local or regional. Railroads and trucking companies are primarily private businesses. Pipelines are generally owned and operated by private companies. The DOT's power comes mainly from funding, regulation, standards, grants, research, data, enforcement authority, and coordination. It's less like the owner of America's transportation system and more like a combination of a banker, a referee, a safety manager, a data analyst, a rule writer, and a project partner. So when a local road has a pothole large enough to qualify for a waterfront property, calling the Secretary of Transportation may not produce immediate results. The DOT also manages a tremendous amount of federal money. The president's fiscal year 2026 budget request proposed approximately $111.3 billion in DOT budgetary resources, plus about $35.8 billion in advanced infrastructure funding, for a total of approximately $147.1 billion. That figure was a budget request, not a measurement of every transportation dollar spent in America, but it illustrates the scale of federal involvement. Transportation itself is a major part of the national economy. In 2024, transportation services contributed approximately $1.9 trillion, or 6.3%, to an expanded measure of United States gross domestic product. There were approximately 3.48 million truck drivers in the American workforce, and trucking represented more than 1/3 of employment in the transportation and warehousing sector. Commercial trucks accounted for approximately 10% of highway vehicle miles traveled in 2024, yet they moved the majority of domestic freight by value and played a dominant role in trade with Canada and Mexico. In 2024, trucks carried approximately $1 trillion worth of goods across the northern and southern borders, representing more than 3/4 of the value of surface freight moving between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Those numbers help explain why truck policy receives so much attention. Trucks are only one part of the traffic stream, but they are a crucial part of the economy. Nearly everything inside of a home, business, grocery store, restaurant, hospital, construction site, factory, or warehouse spend at least part of its life cycle on a truck. And some products spent their journey inside a tanker being pulled by somebody listening to the Liquid Trucking Podcast. Transportation is often invisible when it works. The customer does not see the federal standards, state inspections, driver training, infrastructure planning, dispatching, maintenance, loading, paperwork, and regulatory compliance that made a delivery possible. They simply see that the product arrived. When transportation fails, however, everybody notices immediately. Shelves empty, plants shut down, fuel becomes scarce, packages stop arriving, prices rise, traffic backs up, supply chains seize. Transportation is the type of industry that receives its greatest appreciation approximately 5 minutes after it stops working. In conclusion, every mile is part of the story. The United States Department of Transportation began operating in 1967 because the country had outgrown a fragmented approach to transportation. America's roads, railroads, airlines, ports, pipelines, transit systems, and shipping networks had become too interconnected to manage as unrelated programs. The department brought together 31 organizational elements and approximately 95,000 employees under one cabinet secretary. Since then, its structure and responsibilities have evolved constantly. The DOT helped guide an era of national vehicle safety standards. It participated in economic deregulation that reshaped trucking, railroads, and aviation. It supported standardized truck dimensions and commercial driver licensing. It adopted an intermodal approach to planning. It created a specialized motor carrier safety agency. It responded to terrorism, hazardous material risks, new technology, aging infrastructure, economic change, and rapidly increasing transportation demand. Not every policy has worked perfectly. Not every regulation has matched the reality drivers experience on the road. And not every government acronym has improved a conversation. The relationship between trucking and the DOT will always contain tension. Drivers and carriers operate in the real world, where weather changes, customers delay trucks, parking disappears, traffic stops, equipment breaks, and the clock always continues moving. Regulators operate in a world where rules must be written broadly enough to cover millions of drivers, vehicles, companies, roads, and circumstances. Those two worlds do not always fit together cleanly, but they depend on one another. Without professional drivers and carriers, regulations cannot move a single pound of freight. Without national standards, infrastructure investment, safety oversight, and coordination, the transportation system could become dangerous, inconsistent, and inefficient. The DOT number on a truck is more than an identification number. It's the product of more than a century of federal transportation policy. The CDL in a driver's wallet connects back to the effort to create one national standard for commercial qualifications. The dimensions of the trailer reflect laws designed to make interstate freight practical. The bridge inspection, hazmat placard, vehicle standard, highway grant, crash report, safety audit, railroad crossing, and pipeline marker are all pieces of the same long history. The Department of Transportation was created because moving America is not a single job. It is millions of jobs performed by drivers, mechanics, dispatchers, engineers, construction workers, inspectors, pilots, mariners, railroaders, warehouse employees, researchers, emergency responders, state officials, and federal employees. Some build the system. Some regulate it. Some repair it. Some study it. And some climb into a truck before sunrise and make the whole thing useful. Drivers may never love every DOT regulation. They may not even like most of the forms. But every time a truck crosses a state line, follows an interstate, passes over an inspected bridge, carries a regulated product, or delivers freight safely to a customer, it becomes part of the transportation system the department was created to support. The story of the DOT is not really the story of a governing building in Washington, D.C. It is the story of how the United States learned to connect its roads, vehicles, industries, and communities into one national network. It's a story written in concrete, steel, asphalt, regulation, fuel taxes, safety standards, court decisions, and more acronyms than any reasonable society should tolerate. And for professional drivers, it's a story that continues with every mile. Because long before the customer opens the box, pours the product, starts the machine, fuels the vehicle, or stocks the shelf, somebody has to get it there. And that means the history of American transportation is, in a very real way, the history of trucking. Thank you so much for joining us here on this very special presentation of Trucking Up History presented to you by the Liquid Trucking Podcast. I've been your host, Marcus, for the day, and I hope you learned something. I know I certainly did. I learned that regardless of all of this history, trucking will still be wrapped in a little bit of red tape, but it's all meant to get us there safely and keep those shelves stocked. Stay safe out there, Liquid drivers, and keep the shiny side up. We'll see you next week right here on the Liquid Trucking Podcast.
Thanks for tuning in and being the gold standard of drivers on the road. Be sure to like and subscribe to the channel and tune in next week for another episode of the Liquid Trucking Podcast.
Interested in finding out more about what it takes to bring a podcast like the Liquid Trucking Podcast to your fleet? Bulldog provides tailor-made top-to-bottom podcast production services. We'll meet your terminal staff, connect with your drivers, and bring you the content you want your drivers to hear. Type bulldog.works into your browser to connect with us and learn more about what we can do for your fleet. That's bulldog.works for podcasts, tenacious recruiting, and more.